Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Esther Lee, President of the Chinese American Heritage Foundation. Today is our first webinar to kick off the celebration of AAPI Heritage Month. We are so excited to have Ed Tepporn, the Executive Director of Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation, AIISF, to share with us their new museum at the Angel Island. Ed immigrated from Thailand to Texas in the 1970s, graduated from Washington University in St. Louis, and has worked in a nonprofit field for nearly 25 years. He previously served as Executive Vice President of the Asian and Pacific Islanders American Health Forum, which is one of the oldest and largest national advocacy and policy organization for Asian Americans. He created and expanded the organization Chief Strategy Office alongside the board and the senior staff, and he oversaw granting efforts to garner $32 million in funding over 10 years. I came across a quote which Ed mentioned in Envision website. He said, connecting the history of the past with what's happening today and in the future. That surely matches our CHF theme on the logo, past, present, future, but which is written in Chinese. And so after, just one reminder, during and after the presentation, if you have any question, please type in the Q&A box instead of the chat box. That will be easier for me to just look into one place when there are any questions for Ed. So without further ado, let me introduce you Ed Tepporn, and let me spotlight it.
Thank you so much, Esther, for that warm welcome. And thank you to the Chinese American Heritage Foundation for the opportunity to kick off Asian Pacific American Heritage Month with you again. This is such an important month for all of us to be able to lift up our histories, our own stories, and to learn about the other communities that make up this rich, diverse set of communities that we call the Asian Pacific Islander American community. And the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation has worked for over the past 40 years to ensure that the buildings at the former U.S. immigration station at Angel Island remain standing so that all of us and all of our communities can come together and still learn about this important to remember history and to examine how those histories connect to what's happening in the world today and how they potentially influence and inform how we treat one another into the future. I will be sharing my screen now, and what I'd like to invite all of you to do is, as I'm pulling these slides up, I know some of you have had the opportunity to visit Angel Island before, and some of you have not. If you could maybe just type into chat your name and where you're visiting from today, and if you've ever been to Angel Island. And so what you see on screen here is the new Angel Island Immigration Museum, which we are so excited to finally open. We'd originally intended to open this building to the public back in 2019, and then there were some delays due to some construction issues, and then COVID happened. So we finally had the opportunity to open the museum in January of this year. And so if you've never been to Angel Island, hopefully this is another reason to come out and visit. And if you've been before, then this is hopefully an opportunity to come out and see something new. This building has actually never been opened to the general public in the site's history until it was opened in January. For those of you who joined last year, you might recognize some of these slides. Just to start things off, I want to provide everyone with just a broad overview of the history of what happened at Angel Island, and then I'll move into some of the slides featuring some of the exhibits that we have featured in this new Angel Island Immigration Museum, and to talk about some of the histories and stories that we're able to share. So as many of you know, the recent events that we've seen over the past 2 years, where we've seen increased racism and xenophobia, over 10,000 anti-Asian attacks and recorded instances of harassment against our communities. These things are not new. They have their roots that trace back to when our communities first came to the US. We know that in even the past 20 years, there's been a spike in bias and anti-Asian Pacific Islander attacks against our communities. And so part of that history that we're seeing now, part of the current events that we're seeing now have deep roots in US history, unfortunately. So we know that many Chinese laborers came over when there was the discovery of gold. They came here in hopes of finding new opportunities in terms of being able to strike fortune and perhaps support their families and villages back home. And then once the gold rush ended, many of those Chinese laborers stayed on to help support the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, which was a very dangerous work. We also know, however, that once that Transcontinental Railroad was finished and completed, the laborers weren't able to ride the railroad cars that they'd helped to construct this pathway for back home. And so as they made their way back to many cities and towns across the West Coast, what they encountered was an economic depression, high competition for jobs. And much as we've seen across history, when those circumstances exist, immigrants often bear the brunt of stigma and stereotyping. And so anti-Chinese sentiment was at a high during those times. Our communities experienced lynchings, arson, mob riots in cities and towns across the US. And that's what you see depicted in these historical paintings on this slide. Unfortunately, that racism and xenophobia also got translated into our nation's immigration policies. So starting with the Page Act of 1875 that really sought to keep out Chinese women, to the Immigration Act of 1882, which established this term likely to become a public charge, which became a rationale for barring someone from immigrating to the US, to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which marked the first time in our nation's history that a country's laborers were barred from entering the country and its citizens were barred from becoming US citizens, from naturalizing. There were definitely exceptions to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. If you were a diplomat, if you were a business owner, if you were a student, or if you were traveling through just temporarily on vacation or tourism, then those were accepted classes where you would be allowed to enter, but you still could not become a US citizen. And the Chinese Exclusion Act wasn't the end of it. What we saw in the decades that followed were a whole list of exclusionary immigration policies that expanded upon the Chinese Exclusion Act to eventually include most countries from across Asia and the Pacific. And that's what you see on the bullet points on the screen. So for those of you who've not been to Angel Island before, it's the largest island in San Francisco Bay. And it's, as you see on the right-hand side in that north upper left corner, that's where Angel Island is located. It's about 700 or so acres. And on 20 of those acres in the northeast corner of Angel Island sits the US Immigration Station. Now this land sits on the ancestral lands of the Coast Miwok Indians. It was colonized by Spain, then came under Mexican rule, and then during the 1850s came under US rule. And so Angel Island has multi-layers of history, not just related to the immigration station, but there were forts that were around during the Civil War. There's a Nike missile base that's on Angel Island. But what the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation does, and that's the organization that I have the privilege of serving as the executive director for, is we're the primary nonprofit organization that helps to preserve the buildings at the Angel Island Immigration Station and to uplift its histories and stories. And so over the past 40 years, we've actually raised over $40 million in public and private funds to help save the buildings, to help restore them, and to help reinterpret them as museums and learning spaces and meeting spaces, not just for the Bay Area, but hopefully for the entire country. If you ever have the chance to come and visit Angel Island, or if you visited before, you'll note that Angel Island really is this natural oasis in the middle of San Francisco's urbanness. There's beautiful hiking trails and biking trails, but alongside that beautiful scenery is a really poignant history that unfortunately still many US citizens and residents and immigrants aren't familiar with. And so as you listen to today's presentation, and if you learn something new about Angel Island, my ask is that you reach out and talk to at least one person, one family member, one friend, and help us spread the word in the history of Angel Island so that more people across the US are familiar with this important to remember history. What you see on the screen is a quote from one of the doctors who oversaw the public health service. And I'm not going to read the quote, but in going through it, what you'll notice is that there were definitely stereotypes against the Chinese and against other Asians back then that essentially stereotyped us as being dirty, as being disease bearing. And so if you can just imagine that the doctors and administrators at the Angel Island Immigration Station held these beliefs, then you can only imagine then how they treated the Chinese immigrants and other Asian immigrants who were held in detention at Angel Island. What I'll do over the next couple of slides is show you a little bit of before and after. So on the left-hand side of the screen are images of what the site used to look like beforehand. And then on the right-hand side is a sneak peek, if you will, of what the site looks like now and some of the exhibits that you have to look forward to when you come out and visit. So to start off, we know that Angel Island is sometimes referred to as the Ellis Island of the West. Angel Island, when it was built and designed, some of the detention barracks as well as the hospital building on the site were actually modeled in some cases after the buildings on Ellis Island. And we know that there was this increase in Chinese and other Asian immigrants trying to enter the US. After especially two key events that happened on the West Coast. The first was in 1898, there was the Supreme Court case of the US versus Wong Ark, which established birthright citizenship. So even though the Chinese Exclusion Act said that Chinese couldn't become US citizens, what this US Supreme Court case established was that birthright citizenship applied to Chinese as well. So for those Chinese who were born in the US, they would be considered US citizens. And then we also had the 1906 earthquake and fire, which burned down many of the buildings that held the administration records and the birth records for the city of San Francisco. And so you had this unique situation where Chinese laborers who were actually born in China would come forward claiming that they were born in the US. And because of the Supreme Court case of the US versus Wong Kim Ark, they were then US citizens. At the time, there were also immigration policies that said that if you were a US citizen and you had sons and daughters born abroad, you could bring those sons and daughters over. And so we have the set of circumstances where Chinese laborers born in China came forth declaring that they were US citizens, but also stating that they had a number of sons and daughters back home in China that they wanted to bring forward. And that established this practice of what's now known as paper sons and daughters, where people would purchase these alleged identities of these sons and daughters. They would then be given coaching books in many cases to practice for the immigration interviews that would be part of their experience in terms of trying to enter the US. And those coaching books would contain questions and answers to a number of things that might help to establish someone's identity so that they could, in these interviews, verify that they were related to the person that they were allegedly related to. And I'll talk about those interviews in just a little bit. What you see on this slide is the former administration building on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, the building that you see is actually the detention barracks, and that's because the administration building burned down in 1940. But it is represented on the right-hand picture by the concrete outline of where the building once stood. So this is the viewpoint that immigrants landing at Angel Island would see as soon as they stepped foot on the island. Now, remember back then in the 1910s to 1940s, especially in the 1910s, there wasn't airline travel. People made that voyage across the Pacific Ocean in an ocean liner, and that voyage could take 2 to 3 weeks. If we came from money and had the privilege of traveling in first class, then that was perhaps a more comfortable ride. But for many of us, we were probably traveling in second class and third class in very cramped and crowded conditions. So once we saw the San Francisco skyline come into the view, we would probably be so excited to finally get off of that cramped and crowded boat. But what would happen is the immigration officials would meet the ocean liners in San Francisco Bay. For those passengers traveling in first class, they would have the opportunity to have a very cursory medical exam and very cursory review of their papers. And then in most cases, they were allowed to actually deboard directly to San Francisco. But if the immigration officials didn't believe that we were who we said we were, or thought that we weren't one of the merchant classes or a diplomat or student, or if they thought that we had one of the excludable medical conditions, or if they thought that we might be someone who might eventually become reliant on public support, again, that term likely to become a public charge, then we were then put onto a ferry and transferred over to the Angel Island immigration station. Once we landed at the immigration station on this dock, we would have to leave our large suitcases in a storage shed, and then we'd only be able to access them once a week. We'd make our way into the administration building for some cursory registrations and some cursory inspections, and then we would then be sent on into the detention barracks. Now, these detention barracks were very cramped and crowded, especially if you were Chinese or if you were an Asian Pacific Islander. For immigrants arriving on Angel Island, their experience was very different from that of those at Ellis Island. Ellis Island was created to quickly process European immigrants so that they could then enter the country, whereas Angel Island's immigration station was specifically built to interrogate and to detain Asian immigrants and to try to keep our communities out of the US. So there were many, many more Asian immigrants in detention at Angel Island than there were European immigrants. While the European immigrants at Ellis Island only spent a couple hours at Ellis Island, the Asian immigrants at Angel Island might spend anywhere from 3 days to 3 weeks was the average, but the longest period of detention was actually by a Chinese woman by the name of Kwok Shi, who spent almost 2 years in detention before she was deported back to China. The left-hand side is a historic image of the cots that the immigrants were to sleep on. And when Chinese men first arrived at Angel Island, in the first year or two that the station was open, they were not given mattress pads to sleep on. They had to sleep on these hard metal cots. And on the right-hand side is a recreation of what the detention barracks looked like back then. In rooms that were supposed to only hold maybe 50 people, at times they might hold as many as 200 people, stacked 3 tiers high in these double-wide barracks, these double-wide bunks. And so you can just imagine how claustrophobic that must have felt. The immigrants on Angel Island were segregated in a number of different ways. So Asian immigrants, because they were, again, thought to be dirty and disease-bearing, and because there were all these exclusion laws that applied to Asian immigrants, were kept separate from the European immigrants. The Chinese were kept separate from other Asians, and men and women were kept separate from each other. There were separate detention barracks for men and women. As you can see on the screen, there were different dining halls. There was actually a European dining hall and a non-European dining hall. And we know that the quality of the food for Asians was pretty horrific. It actually shows up in some of the poems that are carved into the walls on Angel Island, the poor quality and the poor taste of the food. We also know from historical records that the immigration officials spent more money on the European meals than they did on the Asian meals. And the quality of the Asian meals was so bad that it actually led to food protests by the Asian immigrants, which then ultimately resulted in some changes, but then not everyone was still satisfied. So the right-hand side is an image of where we've set up picnic tables now in one of the former mess halls so that people can have the opportunity to experience that experience of dining under detention. And then part of the process of making your way through Angel Island were what was called a port of special inquiry, which was essentially an interrogation. While there wasn't physical violence, these were very grueling interviews where Chinese immigrants in particular would be asked hundreds upon hundreds of questions. And these questions, again, were trying to validate their identity and their connection to their alleged relative here in the US. On the left-hand side is a historic image from one of these boards of special inquiry. And on the right-hand side is an exhibit that symbolizes what those boards of special inquiries looked like. Oftentimes there would be an immigration official, a stenographer who would type down and keep record of all the questions and the responses, and in many cases a translator, because for many of these immigrants, they might not speak English or they might not have English proficiency. And so these questions would be, while very simple, there would be so many of them, and oftentimes it'd be hard for even someone someone who was telling the truth about their identity to get these questions right. So they'd be questions like, what direction does the window in your bedroom face? How many steps are there in your house? What's the name of the neighbor who lives 3 doors down for you? What's the name of their dog? These, again, are questions that are very basic, but if you didn't answer the right way, that could potentially raise flags and could be grounds for the immigration officials marking your file and having you fail your Board of Special Inquiry. Many of the Chinese and many of the immigrants who undertook this Board of Special Inquiry actually failed on their first go around. But the Chinese in particular were familiar that in the US, there was this legal appeals process. And that's part of the reason why detention for Chinese immigrants was so much longer, is that as they made their way through these appeals processes, it typically took a couple of weeks or a couple of months to process those appeals and to have those appeals happen. And so if they had 1, 2, or 3 appeals, then that potentially lengthened their period of detention on Angel Island. And so while many people might be familiar with how Chinese were detained at Angel Island, Chinese definitely were the largest group of immigrants who were detained at Angel Island. There were definitely other groups that experienced large numbers of their journeys being traced through Angel Island. So that includes the Japanese, Russians, South Asians, Filipinos. There are actually people from over 80 different countries in the 30 years that Angel Island was open that traced their journey to the US through Angel Island. And you see some of those groups represented on the screen. After World War II, the building was slated for demolition in the early 1970s. And fortunately, there was a local organizing effort by community leaders, by academics who recognized that this was a very special and historic place, and that it was meaningful not only for the Chinese and Asian Pacific Islander communities, but it was a place that's meaningful for the entire country. And so they started this organizing effort that ultimately saved the buildings, that secured California historical landmark status for the building, and then a few years later in 1997, established national historic landmark status for the buildings. And what helped to save the buildings is that there were over 200 poems carved by the Chinese detainees into the barrack walls. And these poems really do tell the experiences, the emotions of what these detainees experienced while they were under detention. And as you read through these poems and see the translations, I think for me, it's really evident that many of these experiences are getting echoed by those immigrants who come to our country today. So on the screen is perhaps one of the best well-preserved poems that we have on the site. It's entitled Detained in This Wooden House. And you can see from the picture that these poems are just very intricately carved. Many of them are very beautifully etched, and that they also contain literary themes from Chinese literature that really point to the fact that the people who wrote the poems were very well educated. It's our belief that these poems were probably a team effort, because the skills related to carving are not necessarily the skills related to poem writing, but we don't have a lot of information in terms of what was the process used for determining which poems got carved into the walls. And in very few cases do we know the authors of the poems, because these were considered graffiti by the immigration officials. They were plastered over and painted over, and you could get in trouble if you were caught writing these poems into the walls. So what I want to do, especially for those of you who've not had the opportunity to visit Angel Island before, is last year we launched a 3D virtual tour that provides those who might live a little bit further away from the San Francisco Bay Area to have a chance to still visit Angel Island and experience it. Now, there's nothing that can replicate the actual feeling and sense of history and emotion that you get from walking in the halls and the rooms of the Angel Island Immigration Station, especially the detention barracks. But virtual exhibits like these are perhaps the next best thing. And so I'm just going to take a moment to load up this 3D exhibit. You can see the website up here, and I'll type that into chat in just a little bit. But this is a 3D scan of what Angel Island looks like today. And when you actually go to this website, there's a guided tour that is led by Casey Dexter-Lee, who's one of the park staff. She's actually lived and worked on Angel Island for over 21 years. I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit. And so this building that you see in front of us is the detention barracks. And again, in this tour, you can just kind of move the screen around so that you can see the entire site and look where you'd like to focus your attention. And then the tour does take us into two of the rooms inside the detention barracks. And so let me just, did my screen just freeze? There we go. So this is room 105. It's on the first floor of the detention barracks. And each of these poles that you see in the room is where we had one of those double wide sets of 3-tiered cots stationed. And so you can imagine how crowded this room must have been. But what I want to take you to is this part of the virtual exhibit where we actually have an opportunity to hear one of the poems called Random Thoughts Deep at Night, read out loud in Cantonese.
Section of the wall. This poem, placed a little bit high up on the wall, has a couple unique elements. Not a lot of the poems here have titles or signature lines, and this one has both. This poem's called Random Thoughts Deep at Night, and it was written by Yi of Toisan. Now, there's a lot of imagery in this poem that uses nature to describe how the person is feeling. And you can almost imagine the person being here on a foggy day in the middle of San Francisco Bay. We also have a recording of this poem in Toisanese, which is the dialect that most people that came through here probably spoke.
呀，但那北木那丰收啊山，炎炎相谈的根根那弯呢，文木山山的呀嘛汉呐，青山的文梅呀man，北府天蓝的汉天啊，汉那个少年。
So I'm going to type into chat the website for this this virtual exhibit, and I encourage you to visit it on your own. What I would like to do now is actually take you into the Angel Island Immigration Museum. We don't have a similar 3D virtual model for that just yet, but I do want to share with you some of the exhibits and stories that we have included in that museum. So this is the former hospital building where we now have our Angel Island Immigration Museum. And this set of pictures just gives you a sense of how much disrepair this building was in. And that's why it took 7 years and $15 million to restore the building, to renovate it, and to reimagine it as a museum space, as well as a meeting center. Unlike the detention barracks, which we tried to keep as historically accurate as possible, because this hospital building was so far gone, as you can see in these pictures, we felt that it gave us an opportunity to rethink this building and to make it look a little bit more modern. And that's what you'll see on these next couple of slides. So this is a map of the 10,000 square foot building. On the first floor, we have an entry room as well as some multi-purpose rooms. We're going to be opening a welcome room and a gift store in the next couple of months. But it's on the second floor at the top of the page where we have our 3 permanent exhibits. And I'll go through each of those exhibits in just a little bit. We also have some space that are empty rooms currently, but we're hoping to continue to fundraise to fill those rooms. One of those rooms we'd like to fill with temporary rotating exhibits. And one of the other rooms, that remembrance and reflection room, we're hoping to actually use as an opportunity for holding lectures, musical performance, and also a space for people to contemplate their visit to Angel Island. So this is, again, on the first floor. This is the very first exhibit that you'll see in the entry room. It's just welcoming people to the new museum. And what you see, the pictures that you see just highlight some of the stories and the histories that are showcased in the museum's exhibits. The first exhibit that we encourage people to visit is this room here, and this is our In the Shadows exhibit. So this exhibit continues the stories of detention and exclusion that are really poignantly and emotionally showcased in the Detention Barracks Museum, the former detention barracks. And it continues those stories, but it also expands those stories to talk about immigration policies after the immigration station closed in 1940, and also about how detention and exclusion have continued to be experiences of immigrants, for example, along the southern border today. One of the people that we feature in the barracks, in the Shadows exhibit is Dilp Singh. And on the next page, I'll just share a little bit of Dilip's history. But what you'll notice about this room is it's a little bit darker because this is a darker history. And also the way the exhibits are assembled, it creates almost this confined labyrinth. And given the themes of detention, we wanted people who visited to have that sense of feeling shut in a little bit when they went through this exhibit. So again, it's important to recognize that people from all across the world were detained on Angel Island. Dilp Singh is someone from India who spent time on Angel Island. He eventually became a migrant worker in San Francisco along the Sacramento River Delta. And at the time, there were rules that prohibited Asians from owning land. So he wasn't able to purchase his, or even rent his own land. But fortunately, he had a friend who did so on his behalf. And I think that's one of the stories that we often see in some of the stories that are featured in the Angel Island Immigration Museum, is that for as many of the challenges that our communities face as immigrants to the US, there are also these people who, and organizations who help us out along the way, whose help makes a difference for us. I know that's true in my own immigration story, that our friends and neighbors in Houston definitely helped us to try to acclimate to US customs and US cultures. And it wasn't until much later in the 1950s that Dilp Singh was finally able to purchase his land, and also he became a US citizen. Wing Ji is another person whose story is featured in this exhibit. Wing is a paper son, and so his father had actually come to the U.S. as a Wing isn't a paper son, he's a son of a paper son. And his father had traveled back to China and had married Wing's mother and had several kids, and Wing was brought over. And so he was then essentially traveling under an alleged identity because his father technically was a paper son and wasn't a true citizen. And then there was a period later in US history where paper sons and daughters were encouraged to come forward and declare themselves. And his family ultimately had to make the choice whether or not they wanted to do that or not. The next exhibit that we have is called Under the Microscope, and this exhibit focuses on the site's history, this building's history, as a hospital for the immigration site. And then what it also includes is a number of exhibits that talks about the connection between immigration policy and public health law. And so this is one of the photos that is included in the Under the Microscope exhibit. One of the differences between the experiences of Asian immigrants at Angel Island versus European immigrants at Angel Island is that for European immigrants, they often underwent very cursory medical exams, whereas we know from historical records that the Asian immigrants were often forced to strip completely naked, to provide blood and stool samples, all in the hopes of the medical doctors finding these diseases like tuberculosis or ringworm or liver flukes, that if the immigrant was found to have these conditions, they would be sent to the hospital, they'd have to pay for their own treatment. And if they couldn't afford that, or if they didn't get better, then that was potentially grounds for deportation. Now, culturally, we also know that this experience of these medical examinations was challenging for the Chinese and other Asians, particularly for women, because think about Chinese medicine, right? You don't typically, when you see a Chinese herbalist, you don't disrobe, you remain fully clothed. We know that white is also in Chinese culture the color of death. And so imagine that you are a Chinese immigrant coming to the US. You thought you were going to be landing in San Francisco and you get ferried over to this detention center. And all of a sudden, this person dressed all in white, who was a doctor, is telling you to fully disrobe. For women, that just goes against so many of the cultural norms and experiences that they had. And it was, we know that for many of the Chinese female immigrants who came through Angel Island, through their recollections, that this was an especially mortifying experience for them. This particular picture is likely a staged picture because, as you can see, there's a little bit of privacy. The immigrants and detainees are not fully disrobed, but this, like many of the other historical pictures that we have, we imagine are probably posed pictures. And then the final exhibit is called Opening Doors. And in this exhibit, we celebrate the histories and journeys of immigrants, both those who came through Angel Island, as well as several immigrants who came more recently. We were very conscious in selecting the stories for this particular exhibit to try to diversify the stories that we're able to connect to on Angel Island, because we definitely want those who are descendants or former detainees of people who experienced Angel Island to feel a sense of connection to Angel Island. And we want these families, and maybe there's some of you who are on this Zoom webinar, to continue to feel that deep sense of connection to Angel Island. But we also recognize that it's important for everyone who visits Angel Island to experience that same sense of connection. So much like how if you're an immigrant, you automatically often feel this immediate sense of connection to the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island for the welcome that it represents, we do hope that immigrants and people who are allies of immigrants and so who support immigrants feel that same sense of connection to Angel Island for its reminder of this darker history and how we can hopefully try to not repeat history going into the future. And so one of the stories that we actually include in the Opening Doors exhibit is that of Tyrus Wong, who you see here on the screen. Tyrus is probably known to many of you. He was a Disney animator who is probably most famous for the beautiful backdrops he drew for the movie Bambi. And several years ago, we had the opportunity to interview Tyrus and had a short video made about him. So I'm just going to take a few moments to play that video now. And then we'll pause and open it up for questions. Oh, let me make sure I turn on the sound so you can hear the sound.
Growing up, I happen to love to paint and draw. That's one thing. I just like to do that. Well, my name is Tyrus Wong. I was 9 years old when I come over to America. We call it Dilp Singh. In Chinese, it's the Golden Mountain. So, you know, the opportunity is supposed to be better over here. That's why they all want to come over here for that reason. You know, we came in the first class. My father probably had to borrow the money for that. When I get to the island, all of a sudden, I don't see my father. And being 9 years old, I wanted to see what happened. It was so sad. I don't remember that we saw him again. They call a place called the Wooden House, Muk Tuk. before. There's no other kid but myself, so no playmate at all. You know. I found out that the Chinese ladies stay over there over 2 years. Can you imagine that? Stay over 2 years. And of course, some of them committed suicide. I met the man that his brother jumped off the roof and killed himself because it's, you know, just can't stand that. Say that a lot. I'm worried most time it's about my father. I said, what happened to my father? I don't see him, you know. I asked God what happened. And I don't speak the English, so he just suffered that, you know, whatever day I stay there, it's just, every day it's just miserable, miserable. I hated that place, just like a jail. But at such time, I had no material to do. So I don't do any painting at all. In fact, I got more things that scare me than painting. You know, I'm scared whether I can be landed or not. I remember one of the guard that gave me a piece of chewing gum. He told me, no, don't saw, don't eat it. You just chew. So I just keep on chewing and chewing and chewing. And then but chew till no taste to it. You know. So I found a radiator there. So I put it on top there and let the thing melt down and I catch it with a paper and put it back there and melt and catch it with paper for 3 times just to kill time. Pages and pages. You have to study that for a month. It's a trick question. It's a trick question. You know what? Only trying to trick you. They know it was fake. I'm sure they that dumb that you know, they know it was fake, but they just make it hard for you. And that guy, the main guy, he's bald-headed. That guy, I can never forget him. The way he looked, because he's very different, very stern, you know. He doesn't crack a smile, you know. 9 years old, I was scared half to death. How many days I actually stayed there, I don't know. But anyway, if I saw my father, oh, I was so happy, you know. And then I could see that he had more or less tears, you know, in his eye. I think he'd been worrying about me too.
Ed, you are muted.
Thank you. So this and many other videos are available on our YouTube page. And what I wanted to do just to close out my presentation is to share with you just a couple of links that you can use to keep in touch with us if you are interested in learning more about the Angel Island Immigration Station. If you ever have the opportunity to come and visit, these are some things that you might find helpful. So definitely our webpage on our website, www.aiisf.org. There's a number of different histories that you can learn about the history of Angel Island, about some of the immigrants who came through Angel Island. And there's also a page that helps you plan your visit, from navigating the ferries to parking to making your way to the immigration station. And if any of you are interested in looking at our virtual exhibit, which highlights even more of the stories of that are featured in the Angel Island Immigration Museum, I'll go ahead and type that into chat as well, so you can look at that at your own leisure. But with that, I'll just pause, and Esther, we'll turn it over to you to see if there's any questions that have come in and see what kind of discussion we can have together.
Okay. So now it's Q&A time. So I do have 2 questions. So the first one is, of the total Chinese immigrants that passed through, what percentage were women? What percentage were deported back? And what percentage died on Angel Island?
Those are great questions. Unfortunately, I don't know the answers to all of those questions, but we do know that there were definitely many more men than women. And part of that is, think back to the time 1910, there weren't as many professional opportunities for women. And so many of the laborers who came over were men. If you were a Chinese woman or an Asian woman coming to the US through Angel Island, more often than not, you were coming over as a daughter or a paper daughter of someone, or as the wife of someone. It's very rare that a woman would travel independently. And for those who did travel independently, they often faced the stereotype of being immoral and were perceived to be prostitutes. It was just something that was part of the experience then. I don't know, it was percentage of men and women. And then the second one was
what percentage were deported back?
So we actually know that the majority of Chinese who came through Angel Island, even though it was built to try to keep out the Chinese and other Asians, for the Chinese, many of them made it through. Only about 10% of Chinese were deported back to China. And part of that was because of the appeals process. While many of the Chinese failed their first Board of Special Inquiry interrogation, through the appeals process, many of them were able to make it through. That's not the case for all communities. So, for example, the South Asian community, almost 50% of South Asians who came through Angel Island were deported back to India or Pakistan at the time.
How about percentage die on Angel Island? Do you have a ballpark idea?
I don't have a ballpark, but as we heard from Tyrus's video, there are some stories of suicides that happened. We unfortunately, with the 1940 fire in the administration building, many of the administration records of who exactly was detained on Angel Island or what happened on Angel Island burned down with the fire. However, many of the immigration files for those boards of special inquiries, those are now with the National Archives. So if you are the descendant of someone who came through Angel Island, if you know their alien identification number, if you know their name or their paper son name or paper daughter name, if they were traveling under an alleged identity, you can actually reach out to the National Archives and try to get those records, which there's many records that are there at the National Archives, and we haven't even been able to uncover all of them.
Okay. Taking inspiration from Alcatraz, was there ever a successful escape from Angel Island or attempt in general?
Right. So Alcatraz is all those movies created Escape from Alcatraz, not that we're aware of. And so Alcatraz and Angel Island are similar in that they were used to hold people, right? So Alcatraz was a prison, whereas Angel Island was operated by the US immigration services to detain immigrants. And so that we know that for the most part, the immigrants at Angel Island were on their best behavior, because if they were to act up, or if they were trying to escape, that could potentially jeopardize their opportunity to enter the US. And so to my knowledge, there's not a record of an escape at Angel Island, but we do know that it is possible to swim back and forth from Angel Island because there are now coyote that are on the island. And if the coyotes are able to swim across to Angel Island, then it's very likely that a person would be able to. Remember also too that the immigration station at Angel Island was just one small part of Angel Island, and much of the other parts of the island were occupied by the US military at the time. So the immigrants there on detention at Angel Island were very clear that if they were to try to escape, that it wasn't safe space on the rest of the island, and that would be a very long swim to reach shore on the other side. And if they were to do so, that would really hamper, if they were caught, that would really hamper their ability to be able to navigate their way into the US.
Thank you. Are you creating any special exhibits, programs, or activities for school-age children?
We are. We actually have a curriculum. It's available on our website that was developed for grade schools K through 12, or 3 through 12, actually, that was developed to help teachers and possibly even parents, now that many parents are taking on some of that supplemental education activity that you can use to help teach and raise students and kids' awareness about the history of Angel Island. The Angel Island State Parks has also had a very long time successful program that they've done for several years, even before COVID, called PORTS, P-O-R-T-S. And if you go to the California State Parks website and look for PORTS, if you're a teacher, what you can do is actually schedule a virtual tour with one of the park staff where they will take an iPad on wheels and essentially wheel you through parts of the immigration station. And it's an opportunity to have that kind of more one-on-one experience. And then we're definitely partnering with state parks as well to continue to think about how do we make the site accessible and friendly for people of all ages, including kids and students, to come to Angel Island and learn about the history of Angel Island in an age-appropriate way. So those things are stay tuned. We actually are working on a set of animated videos right now on the history of Angel Island that we hope to be releasing later this year. And then we also will have some additional exhibits that are specifically designed for kids and youth, because many of the exhibits on Angel Island right now are designed for young adults and up.
Great. Any stories of immigration service officers taking money to let people pass the exams?
It is possible, whether it was immigration station officials or any of the workers, because I mean, this was a massive complex that held hundreds of immigrants at the time and a significant number of staff. So think about how much cooking, how much cleaning, how much laundry there was to keep a site like this up and running. And so there were in addition to the immigration station officials, there were staff that were hired. There were Chinese cooks that were hired to help cook the Chinese meals and the Asian meals. And we actually do have historical photos that show notes that were written on the inside of an orange peel or on the inside of a banana peel that were passed back and forth between the detainees on Angel Island and the broader Chinese community. I don't have specific stories about an immigration official who took a bribe, but it's potentially likely that happened.
Okay. The gentleman that was singing the poem, was he one of the guy that was detained on Angel Island?
Yes. So his name is Calvin Wong,
Okay.
and Calvin was 10 years old when he was detained on Angel Island, and he is one of the few former detainees that we know of who are still alive. There's only a handful of former detainees who are still alive, and many of them were just children when they were on Angel Island. And I think that's one way that history is repeating itself. And you heard this from Tyrus Wong's story, is that it wasn't just men and women that were detained on Angel Island, but in some cases, children were detained on Angel Island as well. And I actually had the privilege of meeting Calvin last summer. He brought his family back to visit Angel Island Immigration Station. And he sat on a set of stairs that he used to sit on when he was living under detention and reminisced about his experiences there. And we have a picture of him sitting on those stairs with 3 of his grandchildren. And it was just a beautiful moment to have the privilege to be able to witness. And Calvin, like many detainees, previously didn't like talking about his experience in detention on Angel Island. For many detainees, it was such a traumatic experience that they never wanted to talk with their families about it. And many, I think, were fearful that they would get retroactively deported, because especially if they came under false papers. But what Calvin recognized was that it was important for his descendants, for his family members, and for the future generations to never forget what happened at Angel Island. And so he's actually given several interviews about his story, especially over the past year or two.
But was he with his father, like Tyrus, with his father at that time?
I don't remember the specifics about his
Oh,
story.
okay.
Yeah, I'll need to double check that.
Yeah, it just sounds so similar that you
Yeah.
said he was like 10 years old or 9 years old. So does Tyrus just now when he was talking about his story. So I was just wondering.
Right. What happened sometimes was if you were traveling with your mom
Hmm.
or sisters, you might get separated from them because people were segregated by gender back then. But he was only 10. So typically it was at the age of 12 that they would uh, move the boys into with the barracks with the other boys and men, but it was that was just on average. So I need to read his story again. I can't remember if he was traveling by himself or with his family.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. So what qualities were used to select the immigration officers beside bilingual abilities?
Right. So the immigration officers in most cases were not bilingual. So they hired
Oh,
Chinese translators to help translate because many of the Chinese didn't speak English. I'm not sure what other qualities that they were looking for in an immigration officer. But we know that for the immigration officers, some were probably very by the law, by the rule book. Others might have had a little bit more of a sense of empathy for the immigrants. And there is actually one historical story of an immigration staff person who fell in love with one of the interpreters, and they both ended up losing their job because at the time interracial marriage was not allowed, and so that's the story of Thailand Schultz is the name of the woman who was actually born in the US, I believe, but was bilingual in Chinese and spoke, became a translator, interpreter at Angel Island. And she fell in
oh.
love with one of the staff people there.
Was that history also shown in your museum?
It's not in the museum, but it's
Oh,
part of our
okay.
Immigrant Voices stories. So we have a collection of about 250 stories that have been submitted by community members of people whose immigration journeys came through Angel Island, or some that even came afterwards. And we definitely encourage anyone who's listening, if you would like to share your own immigration story or your family's immigration story, I'll type into the chat box the website that you can do so. We'd love to add your family or your story to our growing collection of stories.
All right, so one last question. With the deconstruction of the other detainment buildings, were any other Chinese poem carvings lost, or were Chinese not detained in those buildings?
Right. So the women and children are actually detained in the second floor of the administration building. And so anything that was carved there has unfortunately been lost to time. In the hospital building, we didn't see poems, but we did see some inscriptions. Many of them were done in pencil, but we didn't see the same number of Chinese poems that we saw in the detention barracks.
Okay, so it's 9 o'clock. We really want to thank Ed for his precious time for sharing Angel Island and the new museum. I personally learned a lot and I can't wait to visit. I haven't been there. In the chat box, many of them have been to Angel Islands, but I don't think all of you have been to the new museum that was just built a few months ago. So yeah, hope that you guys can go and visit and we can all learn this history together. And thank you again, Ed, for all your time. And maybe if we're going to do another webinar next year, you have more things to share with us.
I hope so. And thank you again for the opportunity to connect again this year. And I hope that everyone has a happy and healthy and safe Asian Pacific American Heritage Month.
Yes, so thank you everyone for attending. And this is recorded. So we get, can I say I get your permission, Ed, to be shared with
Yes,
people that weren't
definitely.
able to come? And if you have any other question about this video that you need to talk to Ed, please email me at cahf.us@gmail.com and I will connect you with Ed so that we make sure everything will be used appropriately. So good night, everybody. Thank you again. Happy AAPI Heritage Month. Thank you. Bye. Thank you, Ed.